Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. President-elect Donald Trump's team is reportedly discussing pursuing direct talks with Kim Jong-un. Today we discuss what President Trump's second-term North Korea policy might look like and what new opportunities there are for South Korea and Japan.
Kim Jong-un was putting on a show to
We're going to fix everything about our country, and we made history for a reason tonight.
So that's what we have to see from the North Koreans, a willingness to talk and to talk in good faith.
those things that are happening out in open sea where they're creating these transfers. So there's a chance for some secondary sanctions.
미국의 조선업이 많이 퇴조를 했는데 한국과의 이런 부분 협력이 되게 중요하다. 그래서 우리도 미국의 경제와 안보를 위한 일이기 때문에 적극 하여튼 여기에 참여하려고 한다.
In the studio with me, Mr. Scott Snyder, the president and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the director of U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He also served as the director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's latest book is the U.S.-South Korea Alliance, Why It May Fail and Why It Must Not. Also joining us, Dr. Kenneth Weinstein, Japan Chair at Hudson Institute. Dr. Weinstein previously served as President and CEO of Hudson. He was also the chair of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, the oversight body for U.S. international broadcasting, now known as the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Dr. Weinstein was previously nominated by President Trump to serve as U.S. Ambassador to Japan during the first Trump administration. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Snyder, President-elect Donald Trump rounded out his cabinet picks, and his inner circles include those who have hawkish views on North Korea. Senator Marco Rubio, nominated for Secretary of State, has in the past called North Korea a criminal syndicate. And National Security Advisor nominated Representative Mike Waltz said the U.S. should return to maximum pressure on North Korea. Their views are not exactly in line with President Trump. How do you think these senior officials' view may shape the Trump administration's North Korea and South Korea policy? Is there a chance of a mixed signals going out?
Well, there certainly is a chance of some mixed signals going out. The first Trump administration suffered, I think, from what I like to call vertical disconnects, meaning that basically the White House did not necessarily communicate or control the various departments very effectively. This time, they have unrolled their nominations much more quickly, and I think it looks like they're much better organized. But I think that it really is true that ultimately President Trump is the decider. And just like any other administration, those who work for the president are the implementers of policy. And so regardless of the positions that Mr. Rubio or Mr. Waltz have put forward previously, I think they'll be charged with implementing the decisions of the president.
Now, Dr. Weinstein, is it fair to say that President Trump has assembled a team of loyalists when compared to appointments made by previous presidents? And what is President Trump's intentions toward its very important ally, Japan? Would Japan be able to establish the kind of strong bond with the Trump administration that Prime Minister Abe was successfully established?
Look, I think the president has certainly assembled a team of loyalists, and unlike the first term, these are people who generally share his views. You remember his first Secretary of State was Rex Tillerson. Rex Tillerson had been recommended to him by Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State, head of the Hoover Institution, and it turned out it was a disastrous choice. The president didn't know him, met with him briefly. This time he has chosen somebody, Marco Rubio, whom he has campaigned alongside in 2016, 2020, and 2024. They are personally close. The president certainly knows Senator Rubio's views very clearly. He knows Representative Waltz's views very clearly as National Security Advisor, Pete Hegseth's views as nominee for Secretary of Defense. And so it's a team that will, in a broad fashion, represent the president's views and give him the options from which they will choose. But as Scott says, it's totally up to the president at the end of the day to make decisions. He lets it be known. This is, it's his. But the cabinet secretaries play an active role in decision making, and so it'll be very different than under the Biden administration, where so much of the policy making was controlled by the White House, and the cabinet secretaries were operated, I believe, at a lower level than in previous administrations. That being said, on the Japan front, this is not going to be the Abe-Trump relationship. That was a once-in-a-century relationship. This was a president who came to power, and Shinzo Abe became his kind of interpreter to the world in some ways. Donald Trump is the first to admit he acts instinctively in terms of his foreign policy views. He's not a policy person. He doesn't read policy books. He looks down, and I think for good reason, at a number of us in the policy world. And Shinzo Abe, who was quite the opposite. He was raised by his grandfather, former prime minister of Japan, his father, the former foreign minister, had a strong geostrategic sense, also had a very high emotional IQ, and he and Trump were able to bond very quickly. And it was really dramatic that by the first week of February, the United States signed on to the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which was Japan's strategy for dealing with the China challenge.
South Korea's ambassador to America recently said that South Korea is off to a good start with President Trump after the first phone conversation. What lessons can South Korean leadership draw from Prime Minister Abe, do you think?
Look, I think the key thing is to get to know who Donald Trump is, how he thinks, to understand the kind of leader he is, and how Trump's options are often outside the box. On North Korea, it was Trump synthesized opposites. It was fire and fury in Pyongyang, but at the end of the day, it became beachfront condominiums, economic development for North Korea. For Trump, the policy gambit doesn't run from the letters, C to the letter D or F. It runs from A to Z. Oftentimes takes A and Z together. I think President Yoon is in a strong position to be a close friend of President Trump. I think they're both strong personalities. They're outside the box thinkers. They don't really both come from the world of politics per se. And I think they're likely to get along well. I even think Prime Minister Ishiba and President Trump will get along, because Prime Minister Ishiba is an outsider. He 5 times sought to be elected prime minister. He despises the Tokyo establishment. He represents rural areas. He's raised a lot of fundamental questions about Japan's role in the world. And in that sense, I think they'll get along just fine as well. It just won't be as close as the Abe-Trump relationship.
And Mr. Snyder, President Trump's team is reportedly already discussing pursuing direct talks with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. If President Trump again pursues direct talks with Kim Jong-un, what approach should President Yoon's team take? And how can South Korea increase its influence over the negotiation process?
I think the first thing is a lot of things have changed since the first Trump administration, and many of those things are things that Trump is going to be discovering as he comes back into office. And so, for instance, Kim Jong-un is really focused on Putin, not Trump. But President Trump has not yet, it appears, updated his view on Kim Jong-un. And the North Koreans have been pursuing a different policy since Hanoi that has really downgraded the prospect of engagement with the United States. And until that changes, I think that it's going to be very hard to achieve any kind of traction in terms of symmetry. Also, the focus on China is, I think, at a different stage. And that means that the U.S. is working much closer with the Japanese and South Korean governments in its competition with China. And so that's going to be a new thing also that President Trump is going to have to take on board as part of his thinking related to how to pursue his policies. And as far as President Yoon goes, I think that the South Korean government is going to engage comprehensively with the United States at many different levels, including at the presidential level. And so I do not anticipate that South Korea will have any difficulty making its views known. It's really going to be more a question of how those views end up aligning with President Trump's instincts.
Japan's main priority with regard to North Korea in the short term is to get back the remaining Japanese who have been abducted by North Korea. That's not to say that they're going to be doing anything less with regard to the North Korea military threat. Japan is building up its missile defense and is doubling its defense spending between now and 2027 with a focus both on the PRC challenge and on the North Korea challenge. But that's what Japan wants. I cannot imagine Japan would do this without some consultation with South Korea. The governments are now aligned as part of a trilateral alliance with the United States. And the truth is, President Trump, behind closed doors, used to talk about the trilateral South Korea, Japan, U.S. alliance during his presidency and encouraged his national security advisors to meet with their South Korean and Japanese counterparts to get things more aligned. So that kind of action would have to take place in consultation.
That's very interesting because there were people who were concerned if the trilateral cooperation will continue under the President Trump, but you're saying President Trump was already interested in that cooperation, even in the first administration. And you said trilateral alliance. Does President Trump want this level to go to the alliance level?
That's what he talked about behind closed doors, I'm told. And if he does that, it's certainly possible. I think the more burden sharing that South Korea and Japan are willing to pick up for us, the more our burdens in Northeast Asia are relieved, the better we are to focus both on our southern border and other global responsibilities. So the more that South Korea and Japan are willing to step up, the better. And I think President Trump would deeply appreciate that.
Was President Trump aware of South Korean people's reservation about possible alliance, the deep security relationship with Korea and Japan?
Of course he was. I mean, he certainly has been and was, and and was quite concerned about the Jisomia incidents and all that. Certainly, absolutely. As far as I know, I mean, he is well aware of what is going on in international affairs, well briefed, follows things, and the like, yes.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder, some are worried about the possibility of the United States going for a nuclear freeze with North Korea if the talks resume between President Trump and Kim Jong-un again, while others say it could be in South Korea's national interest. If the Trump administration pursues a nuclear freeze, what stance should South Korea take? Can Seoul provide momentum for the talks to go to the ultimate level of denuclearization of North Korea?
I'm pretty sure that the Yoon administration will continue to focus on denuclearization as the main objective of any kind of engagement with North Korea. And I'm pretty sure that the Yoon administration will do everything in its power to let people in Washington know that that is their preferred stance. As related to actually giving momentum to denuclearization talks, I don't know that there's that much that South Korean government is going to be able to do because the North Koreans are showing no interest in discussing denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Weinstein, how does Japan feel about a possible small deal between the United States and North Korea of President Trump possibly just going for ICBM moratorium or just a nuclear freeze? Is there a voice within the Japanese government to persuade President Trump to have a more thorough WMD negotiations with North Korea?
Well, I think that there would be concern in Japan, as there was when President Trump undertook the bilateral negotiations with Kim Jong-un and Shinzo Abe, and the president spoke regularly in that time period, and Prime Minister Abe outlined his concerns. I think the Japanese would be very focused, very upfront about their concerns if negotiations would go that way. But as Scott said, we're in a totally different world now. We're in a world where there are North Korean troops in Ukraine, where Russia is providing oil and natural gas to North Korea. We're in a world where the Russian-North Korea alliance is very tight. Kim Jong-un is not short of capital as of now, and at least not short of capital in the way he was when the sanctions were quite effective that the Trump administration put in place with the cooperation of the Chinese and the Russians. And so it's a different world. It's really hard to see how negotiations could move forward effectively, but we shall see.
And Mr. Snyder, the outgoing Biden administration and the Yoon administration recently agreed to a special measures agreement. And with President Trump returning to the White House, there are skepticism both in Seoul and Washington whether the latest SMA will be effective until 2030. What is your outlook and advice to the Korean government?
Well, we'll have to see whether the incoming administration tries to revise the SMA, but I think that what may be more important and really more in line with, I think, the overall tone of what the Trump administration and the president himself may be looking for, as Kenneth suggested, is really a restructuring of the defense relationship in many different aspects. And I would advise President Yoon to follow the advice of the headline of the New York Times, which basically said, smile, flatter, barter. And so that means look for a deal on a revised defense industrial base burden sharing agreement that may well serve the interests of both nations.
Let's move to another topic. Mr. Snyder, some in Korea expect President Trump to be more open to South Korea's nuclear drive because in an interview in 2016, he said that South Korea and Japan's going nuclear may be something that we need to talk about in the future. But when you look at the context, he also said in that interview that we're going to have to talk about it if the U.S. continues on its path, its current path, the weakness, unless we get very strong, very powerful, and very rich very quickly. President Trump also expressed concerns about nuclear proliferation in the world in the same interview. So given this full context, do you think we can expect President Trump to support the idea of South Korea and Japan going nuclear?
We're going back to a campaign interview from 2016. And during the first administration, we really didn't see that issue take on any new momentum. And so I think that it really remains to be seen. What I think that statement really represents is, as Ken has suggested, President Trump is somebody who's willing to think outside the box. And so I wouldn't say that anything would be off the table. But what I would say is that the starting point for that particular conversation, in my view, will be how the Trump administration decides to handle the existing nuclear consultative group discussions, and whether or not those discussions continue in the same form, whether there are some changes in trajectory, or even whether or not they might expand to include other parties, including Japan.
I can't imagine President Trump supporting first Japan going nuclear because the Japanese don't support it themselves. So there's growing movement, and there was definite concern in Japan about the reliability of the American extended deterrent. And we've been through these debates before in NATO. It's what led Charles de Gaulle to have the independent force de frappe and to withdraw from the NATO Joint Command in the early 60s. So, but right now the Japanese are not ready, at all to go in that direction. So that's a non-starter with regard to Japan. That's not to say there aren't people, including Prime Minister Ishiba, who have talked openly when he was a member of the Diet and a private citizen before he was Prime Minister about such things. But many of his concerns parallel the ones raised in Seoul. So at this point, I think it is unlikely. I think that the consultations will continue and will deepen. Donald Trump is a deterrent-oriented president. This is someone who, if you listen to the Joe Rogan podcast or you listen to his talks on the campaign trail, he understood that world leaders took him more seriously because they thought he would actually use some of the extraordinary arsenal we have. That was not the sense under the Biden administration. There was definite concern that we were going at first towards a no first use policy, which was then quickly abandoned, but had been recommended by some people in the Democratic Party. Those days are done. The Japanese were reassured early on in the 2+2 in the first month or so of the Biden administration, and I think that the consultations with South Korea have reassured them. But over the long term, I think it's certainly worth thinking about these issues, not short, medium, but longer term, as we look at our responsibilities and we look at what the Japanese and the Koreans ought to be doing, but we're nowhere near that point yet.
But wouldn't South Korea's possibility of going nuclear, it's all related and linked to U.S.'s commitment, defense commitment to South Korea, the possible troop withdrawal that President Trump had hinted during the first administration?
Yeah, look, as of now, I have not heard him talking about that recently. Granted, he's got a lot on his mind. I think the South Koreans are starting to step up. They're much more closely aligned with us on China than they were in those days. And with President Yoon, we have a president in South Korea who thinks much more like President Trump than President Moon does. So I'm less concerned about that, but right now. But a lot of it has to do with this basing agreement and the issue of what the Japanese call host nation support. And if that lasts or not, it was clearly rushed to get done before the Trump administration comes to power. We'll see. And I agree fully with Scott about the need to talk about defense industrial base and broader defense cooperation. We will need our partners and allies certainly to produce more in the Pacific theater, in the Indo-Pacific, because of the danger of supply chain disruptions. And so all this is very critical and gives Korea a good hand in negotiations.
I want first Mr. Snyder and then Dr. Weinstein's opinion. President Trump will impose a 60% tariff on Chinese goods and may ask allies to join in as well. But South Korea and Japan is highly dependent on China with 20 to 30% of their total trade coming in from China. How should Korea and Japan respond to Trump's sharp tariff hikes, even against allies?
Well, the global tariff is a threat from South Korea's perspective because they're very export dependent. The proposed tariff on China, I don't think that the South Koreans would necessarily implement that tariff in tandem with the Trump administration, but it may create opportunities for South Korean companies to produce and sell more to the United States because their Chinese competitors would be taken out of the market. So it's a mixed effect, I would say.
I agree that it will help South Koreans in the short to medium term. The question really is going to be what tariffs are imposed on South Korea. And in naming Jamison Greer, I know well as a longtime friend, as head of USTR, this is going to be a tariff-focused administration, I think. And I think countries are starting to think through what they need to offer the United States to reduce those potential tariffs. And I think it puts a lot of pressure on both Japan and South Korea, including pressure on them, I think, to work together to try to reduce those tariffs. And one possibility would be for the Japanese government and the South Korean government to work together. The United States wants to build a natural gas pipeline in Alaska that would both create jobs in Alaska, help reduce the trade deficit with these countries, and thirdly, help bring much of the region to dependency on U.S. LNG rather than Russian or Qatari LNG that wouldn't need to flow through the Straits of Malacca or the Straits of Hormuz. So I would encourage the South Koreans to get involved in this and also to consider purchasing more gas and oil from the United States if possible.
So I want both your opinions on this as well. President Trump's team has indicated that it may review the subsidies under the CHIPS Act, which Samsung and SK Hynix has yet to receive. Will this adversely affect the investor confidence in the U.S. market? How should the Korean government and companies wisely approach the Trump administration regarding the CHIPS Act?
Well, I do think that is going to be an issue of major concern that could impact investor confidence. But I think it's also important to note that Samsung and SK Hynix can also work together with the local and state governments to impress upon the Trump administration the importance of the investment. And so that might be the best strategy for counteracting a rollback in terms of CHIPS Act subsidies.
And just to build up on that, the new senator from Indiana, Jim Banks, is very close with President Trump. And SK Hynix has got a $4.7 billion investment in West Lafayette, Indiana, that I'm sure Banks would probably rather keep. And so I think that's one way to go, certainly. But it's going to be the president's decision at the end.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Dr. Weinstein, Mr. Snyder, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.